They're doing what they should be doing, perhaps, for the European Union, but it does create ill will. And as you know, we're going to be doing reciprocal tariffs. So whatever they charge us, we're charging them.
The trade conflict between the United States, Canada, and the European Union is not just another political clash. It's a real economic war in which every move could have dire consequences for the global economy. But what is behind these tariffs, duties, and tough statements? Who will benefit and who will suffer irreparable damage? Today, we'll cover the latest news that touches on this hot topic.
Well, when you look at the kind of input Musk has been having into politics, there has been some polling done which suggests there is a strong dissatisfaction with.
Recently, US President Donald Trump announced new duties on imported cars, including electric cars, from Canada and the EU. The decision, which was supposed to help local manufacturers, actually jeopardized not only the US economy, but also the global market. Canada's response was not long in coming. The country announced a freeze on all payments to Tesla. Why exactly was Tesla among those who suffered damage from this international fight? This decision directly affected the future of one of the most ambitious projects in the automotive industry, aimed at the transition to electric transportation. And the EU. Brussels officially expressed its displeasure, saying that the introduction of such tariffs would undermine the entire international market and affect cooperation between countries that had been built over decades. However, the consequences for European producers were not as obvious as expected. While the US and Canada are preparing for new rounds of negotiations, the Europeans risk losing not only markets but also access to important technological developments.
After Trump imposed those sweeping 25% tariffs on aluminum and steel imports, the European Union retaliating with tariffs on up to $28 billion of U.S. goods. Trump making it clear this isn't over, vowing to respond in kind with sweeping retaliatory tariffs early next month.
At first glance, the situation looks like a standard trade confrontation, but everything is much more complicated. After all, we are talking not only about duties, but also about mutual sanctions, influence on exchange rates, and changes in global supply chains. What does this mean for ordinary citizens? Will cars and other goods become more expensive? How will the new measures affect the overall economic climate, and who will ultimately win in this conflict? And that's where even more interesting questions come into play. If a powerful company like Tesla can't withstand the pressure, what will happen to the rest of the market? Will America be able to maintain its economic power? Or will the market gradually fall into the hands of those who are more flexible in responding to such challenges? Today, we'll tackle all of these questions and more. Expect a detailed analysis of what is happening on the global trade fronts, who will really suffer from the new duties, and who will emerge victorious from this international economic war. Stay tuned, because what is happening now may affect the future of not only individual countries, but the entire world.
After weeks of whiplash, Trump threatening tariffs, imposing some, and walking back others, many Americans are feeling the uncertainty. In Swisher, Iowa, distillery owner Jeff Quint says it's paralyzing.
The bourbon industry is going to be collateral damage in this tariff war. I don't really think there's any way around that.
And he's not alone. Tonight, the majority of Americans, 61%, now say they disapprove of how the president is handling tariffs. 56% say they disapprove of his handling of the economy overall. But the president has dismissed those concerns tonight, saying he has the right to change course.
The trade conflict between the United States, Canada, and the European Union has taken on a new twist that could not only change economic relations between these countries, but also affect the world economy as a whole. This is not just a diplomatic dispute, it is about real losses and threats to major industries such as automobile manufacturing and new technologies. It all started with US President Donald Trump's announcement of new tariffs on imported cars and light trucks made in Canada and the European Union. In January 2025, a month after trade tensions escalated, Trump signed an executive order imposing 25% duties on all cars coming from these countries. The measures were justified to protect American manufacturing and create new jobs domestically. In his view, every car produced overseas became part of a huge problem contributing to the US trade deficit. However, the real impact of this decision on the economy has been far more devastating than it might first appear. Canadian automakers, including giants like Ford and GM, immediately began reducing their production levels, fearing higher prices for their goods. At the same time, European companies such as BMW and Mercedes-Benz said they were unlikely to be able to maintain their shares in the US market if the tariffs remained in place. Experts predicted that such measures could lead to an increase in car prices, which in turn would negatively affect consumer demand and lead to economic stagnation in the US.
With Elon Musk's views on weighing into very much national politics, national elections in Europe. And then on top of that, when you see the backdrop of Tesla upgrading its product line and the impact of them trying to chase more sales at the back end of last year, that means it's short on inventory. It can't necessarily sell as many vehicles or doesn't have as many in stock to sell. So there is that issue there of a confluence of impacts, which means that sales have been falling. Again, the question is how much more that will impact into February as well, given that the back end of last year, in 2024, Tesla sales did slip overall.
However, from the very beginning of this conflict, no one expected that Tesla would be hit the hardest. In response to the harsh measures from the US, the Canadian government decided to take its own steps. In March 2025, it announced a freeze on all payments to Tesla in the amount of $30.11 million. These funds were intended to offset the company's costs of introducing new electric car models to the Canadian market. The decision was made amid growing discontent from the new tariffs, which, according to the Canadian authorities, led to unjustified economic consequences for their market. In an official statement, the Canadian government emphasized that such measures are a response to US economic aggression and that they will continue to take a hard line in dealing with US companies if the situation does not change. So how did Tesla get dragged into this international conflict? It actually started when Elon Musk's company sought to use Canada as one of the key markets for its electric cars. In recent years, Tesla has been aggressively innovating its electric vehicles, targeting the needs of environmentally conscious consumers. But the introduction of new tariffs has jeopardized the company's entire business model in the region. The freezing of payments and subsidies on Tesla cars was the last straw. According to sources in government circles, the decision was driven not only by economic concerns but also by political considerations. Canadian authorities could not afford to leave the situation unaddressed, given the growing protests from local car manufacturers. They feared that the US might start using the tariffs not only as an economic tool, but also as a way to exert political pressure on its neighbors. While many analysts were convinced that the move would further exacerbate trade tensions, Trump himself continued to argue that car tariffs would help support US manufacturing and create more jobs. He emphasized that every imported car is a threat to the country's economy and American jobs. However, despite the US president's assertions, the situation began to unfold in a direction in which not only the US would be the beneficiaries. The Canadian and European markets have started looking for new ways to cooperate. In particular, European automakers have announced possible measures to diversify supply chains and abandon dependence on the US market. European countries began discussing the creation of new trade alliances and the possibility of redistributing the supply of goods to compensate for losses caused by new duties. In response to Canada's actions, the EU and the US began working on a project to create a new free trade network focused on sustainability and independence from US pressure. As part of this project, a number of initiatives were proposed that included lowering internal duties and increasing the production of goods in the territories of the EU and Canada. This could create an alternative to the American market, with the aim of minimizing the impact of tariff restrictions on domestic economies. These processes are already beginning to show the first results. According to statistics, car exports to Europe and Canada increased by 12% in the first months of 2025, which is a direct consequence of the trade conflict. Despite all these measures, the effect of tariffs is already being felt at the consumer level. Rising prices on cars and other goods are causing discontent among American citizens, many of whom have already begun to wonder exactly what they will gain as a result of these duties. As the new duties continue to take effect, it will be interesting to see how this trade conflict unfolds further. Will the US be able to achieve its goal of more jobs in the auto industry? Or will the conflict result in economic losses that prove too great for the entire economy? The questions remain open, and the possible answers seem to depend on how quickly international players can adapt to the new reality. In summary, the trade conflict between the United States, Canada, and the European Union continues to gain momentum, and the consequences for the economies of these countries will be felt for a long time to come.
We begin with the president's trade war escalating tonight. This evening, the retaliation against the United States, Canada, and the European Union responding quickly, just hours after President Trump's 25% tariff on all steel and aluminum coming into the United States. Canada, the largest supplier of steel to the U.S., slapping new tariffs on $20 billion worth of U.S. goods that are sold in Canada. And the 27 countries of the European Union imposing retaliatory tariffs on up to $28 billion worth of U.S. goods sold in Europe.
When, in March 2025, the European Commission expressed deep regret over the U.S. decision to impose duties on automobiles, it seemed to be just another diplomatic statement. However, there were far more serious consequences for the European economy behind it than might at first appear. European automakers such as Volkswagen, BMW, and Mercedes-Benz had already begun to seriously assess the possible damage from the new tariffs. However, this was not the only problem for Europe. In response to the US actions, the European Union announced the launch of a large-scale countermeasure, the introduction of duties on American products, including cars, machinery, and even food products. In particular, duties on cars manufactured in the US increased by 15%. This move was perceived as a direct response to US economic aggression and increased economic pressure on US companies. Among those affected was Tesla, which, despite its ambitious strategy in the electric car industry, found itself in a difficult position. Recall that the Elon Musk company has already faced difficulties in the Canadian market, when in March 2025, $30.11 million in funding was frozen. But now the situation has become even more tense, as the EU has decided not only to respond to the duties, but also to launch an investigation against Tesla, suspecting the company of unfair trade practices. European regulators have accused Tesla of its cars illegally receiving tax breaks that violate the EU's free trade principles. This accusation caused a storm of discussion in European markets, and Tesla was forced to urgently review its sales strategy in Europe. At the same time, many analysts speculated that the situation for Tesla could worsen even more if, in response to the US duties, the EU introduces additional measures to protect local manufacturers. It was expected that as part of the trade conflict, Tesla could face higher prices for components such as batteries and auto parts that it has been buying in Europe. But amidst these economic disputes, another interesting proposal was put forward as the European Union began discussing the possibility of creating a new fund to support European electric car manufacturers, which would level the playing field and help local manufacturers compete with giants like Tesla. All these measures forced Tesla to reconsider its strategies in the European market. It was decided to temporarily suspend deliveries of some electric car models to Europe to avoid additional financial losses. As Elon Musk himself stated in one of the interviews, the company could not afford to continue losing money on the European market if the prices of cars would increase due to high duties. In addition, the tense political situation made long-term planning and investment in the region impossible.
Including Harley-Davidson motorcycles and Kentucky bourbon. President Trump with the Irish Prime Minister visiting the White House today. The president suggesting his tariffs won't stop here, saying, "Of course, I'm going to respond." And tonight, right here, the new poll showing 56% of Americans disapprove of President Trump's handling of the economy. The number's even worse now on the president's tariffs. ABC's chief White House correspondent Mary Bruce leading us off.
Today, President Trump side by side in the Oval Office with the head of the Irish government.
European experts have begun to warn that if the situation does not change, it could lead to a prolonged trade war that would affect not only auto industry, but other sectors of the economy as well. For example, in the technology sector, where American companies such as Microsoft and Apple have also been threatened by new tariffs. One of the most prominent examples was the imposition of tariffs on computers and electronic components made in the US, which could affect major European manufacturers such as Siemens and Philips. Moreover, political tensions began to spread to other industries such as agriculture and pharmaceuticals. European shipments of agricultural products to the US decreased, and US corporations began looking for new markets, which intensified the economic confrontation. The trade conflict, despite its economic basis, became increasingly politicized. market participants began to realize that behind these duties and sanctions were not only economic interests, but also a geopolitical struggle for influence in key markets. It was expected that the US and the EU would seek ways out of this situation through diplomatic channels, but the real threat of a protracted war remained. As the crisis continued to gain momentum, the question of who would be the ultimate winner in this struggle became more and more pressing. Canada, for its part, did not stand idly by. In response to the imposition of duties in the US, the Canadian authorities also began to review their trade policy and proposed new initiatives aimed at diversifying markets. One possible step was the creation of additional economic zones within Canada to encourage trade with developing countries, which could reduce dependence on the US. Despite this, many economists believed that it was the US and Europe that would remain the key players in this conflict. Canada, which itself is an important trading partner for the US, had a hard time getting out from under the pressure. Of course, many experts began to argue that despite the rising tensions, this was not the end of global trade stability. Instead, a trade war could lead to significant changes in global supply chains and a reallocation of trade to new regions. Already, Asian countries such as China and India are beginning to look for opportunities to strengthen their economic position amid lingering conflicts between the US and Europe. The growing interest in Asian markets may become one of the key factors in changing global trade policy, which will also have a long-term impact on global financial flows. As diplomatic battles continue on the world stage, companies like Tesla, BM, and Ford are forced to adapt to the new environment, realizing that the continuation of this conflict could affect their interests for years to come. Regulatory issues, duties, and trade barriers will be addressed not only at the level of governments, but also at the level of large corporations, which are now more dependent than ever on the political situation on the international stage. The challenges facing countries and companies are serious. How to build an optimal trade strategy in these conditions? Who will be more flexible and able to adapt to the new conditions? Time will tell.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency. I'm not like a block that just, I won't delay. It's called flexibility. It's not called inconsistency. It's called flexibility.
As the trade war between the United States, Canada, and the European Union continued to gain momentum, economists began to warn of the possible consequences for the global economy. Predictions ranged from moderately pessimistic to extremely alarming. In fact, the question of how the war would affect world trade relations remained an open question. One of the key points was that each country was trying to find ways to circumvent the duties and remain competitive. For example, the US began proposing domestic tax cuts for major automakers such as General Motors and Ford, which had been hit by the duties. However, such measures, as a rule, did not receive support in the European Union, where, against the background of tariffs, even tougher protection of local manufacturers began. The conflict has particularly affected the sphere of electric cars. Tesla, which used to be considered the technological leader in this area, now found itself at the center of all disputes. Reports that the company lost hundreds of millions of dollars amid new tariffs and political instability began to circulate actively in the media. Some analysts said that Tesla would face major financial difficulties if the duties continued to rise, and that the company might be forced to rethink its business strategy. However, Tesla's management, despite the financial losses, claimed that it was ready to continue expanding production by targeting other regions that would be more favorable in terms of trade. And now, despite all these measures, a new prediction has emerged. Already at the end of 2025, the trade war could escalate into something bigger, an economic depression that would engulf not only the US and Europe, but the entire world. Duties and tariffs were expected to increase the prices of goods and services, which would have a strong impact on consumer demand. This, in turn, could slow economic growth and increase unemployment in countries that are most dependent on international trade. Forecasts showed that if the US-EU conflict continues, global GDP growth could fall by 2 to 3%, with long-term implications for the world economy. At the same time, unexpectedly for many, China became one of the key players intervening in the situation. The Celestial Empire did not stay on the sidelines and began to increase its presence in European markets, which, according to many experts, could become an alternative to American products. China offered the EU to agree to reduce tariffs on Chinese goods in exchange for new investments in their production facilities. This proposal was received with great caution, as no one was sure that China would be able to offer Europe the same high-quality standards as American companies. Meanwhile, many analysts began to discuss possible ways to resolve this trade war through international negotiations. The chances of a peaceful settlement seemed to be increasing day by day. The US and the EU began to intensively search for common ground. It was expected that an important summit between key world leaders would take place in June 2025 to decide exactly how this crisis could be resolved. This summit discussed the creation of new trade agreements aimed at reducing tariffs and simplifying procedures for companies that are affected by the new duties. An important point was that many analysts believed that more flexible terms for business communities could reduce the overall economic damage and return normal growth rates to the global economy. Despite all attempts to negotiate, most countries maintained strong positions. The EU continued to protect the interests of its manufacturers, especially in the automotive sector, where the US and Europe represented the greatest economic interests. However, it also became clear in Europe that local manufacturers could be in a much more vulnerable position if the US increased pressure. Over time, European policymakers began to more actively seek compromises to not only preserve trade relations with the US, but also to strengthen their position in Asian countries. It was proposed to expand the production of environmentally friendly cars, which could be a new competitive advantage in the global market. As the trade war continued to escalate, more countries began to realize that continued conflict could lead to global economic instability. Additional economic measures were introduced, such as tax cuts for large corporations and the creation of new market areas that would avoid undue pressure from duties. However, these steps could not completely eliminate economic tensions. Amid the economic crisis resulting from the trade war, questions were also raised about the possible withdrawal of countries from international trade organizations, such as the World Trade Organization, WTO. Some analysts have said that such action could lead to a profound reorganization of all international trade, leading to more political instability. What is the bottom line? How will events develop in the future? Many experts and political analysts are inclined to believe that this conflict will not be resolved quickly. The trade war is likely to drag on for several years, and during this time the US, EU and Canada will continue to seek new forms of compromise, but only at the highest levels. Time will tell whether the parties will be able to find solutions that will help restore stability to international markets. However, one thing is certain: the consequences of this conflict will be felt for a long time to come, and every new economic decision made by the major powers will have far-reaching consequences for the entire world.